Good evening and welcome to our program, Jones and Company. I'm your host, Christian Jones, and joining us on the special edition of Jones and Company to talk about the impact and history of hurricanes in the northern Atlantic and primarily in the Bahamas. We are joined by none other than Mr. Wayne Neely, a Bahamian meteorologist and hurricane expert. Mr. Neely, welcome to Jones and Company.
It's good to be back, Mr. Jones.
It's good to have you on our program. I remember last year we did a similar program talking about the history, the impact of hurricanes in the Bahamas and some of your publications. And through reading some of your publications, Mr. Neely, I have gained a better understanding of the history of some of the hurricanes that have affected our country, going as far back as the 1860s. And the more that we study the hurricanes that have impacted the northern Atlantic and the Bahamas, the more understanding we get in terms of how we forecast, how we mitigate against some of the effects of these storms. But in terms of your career and the turns your career has taken to the point where you're not only a meteorologist now, but regarded as a meteorological historian. Yes. In terms of looking at your passion for studying hurricanes, especially those of the past, and how your career as a meteorologist and a historian of hurricanes, how did it begin?
Well, actually, my favorite subject in school was actually history and geography. And when I graduated from high school, I was faced with the dilemma of whether I should go into history or geography as a career. I wasn't sure what I wanted to be. I knew that I knew I loved history and I loved geography, and both of them were on the same level for me. I just wasn't sure which one I wanted to be. And when I went to college in the Bahamas, I majored in history and minored in geography. And after I finished college, I decided to go into the Department of Meteorology, become a meteorologist, and that took me into the geography part of it. And I never forgot the history part. So as I became an author, I started incorporating my history into my books on hurricanes, and that's where it started.
Right. In terms of the geography of the Bahamas and how that perhaps plays a role in terms of hurricanes, we have a relatively small landmass, but territorial waters that cover, I think, almost 100,000 nautical miles, a area as big as Spain. In terms of how our geography affects our understanding or even the impact of hurricanes in the Bahamas, what would you say?
Well, it's difficult to be, as a meteorologist, forecasting for the Bahamas is difficult in the sense that you have to divide the Bahamas. It's such a large land area. You have to divide the Bahamas into northwest, central, and southeast Bahamas. And sometimes it's difficult because if you're forecasting rain and thunderstorms for the northwest Bahamas, a person in Grand Bahama will be sunny, and a person in New Providence will be raining nonstop. And so you have the difficulty of forecasting for each individual island, and you also have the difficulty of forecast for each island in each section of the Bahamas. So it's difficult in a way, and we're not like any other Caribbean country. And the most part, when I was forecasting for Barbados, and when I was in school in Barbados, it was easy to forecast the weather systems for Barbados because it was one landmass, and you knew the systems that came in and impacted in Barbados. But in New Providence, you have different systems from different parts. You have systems coming off the northeast.
Geographically,
right? Yes. So you have difficult forecasting, difficult weather patterns, and the movement of the weather patterns and how they impact the Bahamas, weather in the Bahamas. So it's a little more complicated, but it makes me as a scientist, it's an enjoyable thing for me because no 2 days is the same, and it's always a challenge forecasting weather for the Bahamas.
Right. Yeah. When we talk about the different geographical regions of the Bahamas and perhaps some of the typical weather patterns or forecasts for those geographical areas, is there anything that we can see in terms of differences or commonalities between them? I know the southern Bahamas tends to be a few degrees hotter than other parts.
Yes. The northwest Bahamas tend to get more rainfall. On average, you have about 60 60 inches of rainfall in northwest Bahamas, and go down into the southeast Bahamas, you have about 40 inches of rainfall in average. And that means you have significantly less rainfall in southeast Bahamas. And the climate shows they have salt industry in the southeast Bahamas. That won't thrive in the northwest Bahamas because it's too rainy. In the central Bahamas, you have moderate climate. In the northwest Bahamas, you have climate. You have rainforest and pine forest in northwest Bahamas, inside the islands of northwest Bahamas.
Right.
You don't find that in the southeast Bahamas. You have different vegetation patterns as well.
Right. Mangrove fields,
Mangroves,
those
yes.
sorts of things.
Yes.
In terms of, and you mentioned a part of your career in which you forecasted in Barbados, when we look at, and we've talked a bit about it in terms of the geographical differences between the Bahamas and perhaps some other islands in the North Atlantic, that despite the fact that the Bahamas occupy such a small landmass, it features so prominently when we talk about North Atlantic hurricanes.
Yes.
But based off of, and some people will call this area that we're in Hurricane Alley.
Yes.
In terms of the differences or how you distinguish the differences between the Bahamas' vulnerability compared to other Caribbean nations or like Barbados or U.S. coastal states,
Yeah.
what are the differences?
Well, there's significant differences. First of all, Bahamas get more hurricanes than any other country in the region.
Yeah.
The Bahamas is impacted by, in terms of hurricanes, we have 4 types of hurricanes impacting the region. You have the what you call the Cape Verde type, the Gulf of Mexico type, the Southern Caribbean Sea type,
Right.
and each one of those type of hurricanes impact the Bahamas. Whereas, for example, in the Southern Caribbean, you have Trinidad and Barbados. They only get hit by either the Southern Caribbean Sea type or, to a less extent, and the Cape Verde type hurricanes, which comes off the African coast and into the Atlantic and in through the Caribbean,
Right.
and that impacts every island in the Caribbean. But the Bahamas, we also impacted by other hurricanes too, and other type of hurricanes, and that gives. So in other words, we have more hurricanes. The percentage of hurricane hits compared to other islands is completely different as well. And only the state of Florida has similar amount of hurricanes that impacts the region in a certain way.
Right. In terms of the turns and the different alterations in terms of direction that the storm takes, so the different trends that you look at. Of course, when we look at the trajectory of the storm, sometimes there are patterns that go all over
Yes.
the map. How hard is it to predict in terms of sometimes the turns that those storms may take, and what really plays the largest factors? And I know off camera before we started, I asked a bit of a naive question about ocean currents and perhaps how they relate. But how would you describe that?
Well, hurricanes are determined by the stirring currents in the atmosphere, and that stirring currents, and not only the stirring currents, but the pressure, the weather patterns also. For example, area of high pressure, area of low pressure, a cold front will influence the direction of a hurricane. And you look at the pattern, you look at the good thing about hurricane activity now is that the weather models have now made it so accurate now that we now know that they're very accurate. We now know the track of the hurricanes for over a longer distance now than when I first started in meteorology about 35 years ago. Nowadays, you have the tracks are very accurate now. The only problem is the intensity. The intensity forecasting is where we have a problem, where you have hurricane going from category 1 to category 5 in 18, 20, 24 hours.
Right.
And that's difficult to determine, but the track itself is very accurate. The weather models have done an excellent job of predicting the track of the hurricanes with great accuracy. So that's good because it now gives you a greater degree of warning. In other words, you have a longer time to predict, know where a hurricane is going to impact your country. For example, nowadays we have my mother she claims to be an expert meteorologist. Everybody else claims to be an expert meteorologist now just by looking at the daily forecast on either local or international media now. So you can tell now that they can tell from few days in advance, a week in advance, that this storm will not impact the Bahamas, so I shouldn't worry about that storm. whereas 15, 20, 30 years ago, that wasn't the case.
Right.
And you now have more accurate weather models now
What about
and technology.
And of course, technology has played a large role, as you said, in the last 30 years. And of course, we continue to see where, with new cutting-edge technology, it becomes, as you said, easier to look at the trajectory of the storms. But in terms of perhaps more superstitious means by which
Yes.
people have used to
Yes.
predict storms, I've heard people say things, Mr. Neely, in terms of if it's a really hot summer, you
Yes.
anticipate a busy hurricane season.
Yes.
Or even my grandmother, who would say if you see a lot of ants
Yes.
running around, that it means that there must be a large storm coming. Is there any truth to any of those?
There's no truth to Mr. Jones. I've heard them all. Working in the Department of Meteorology, you've heard them all. You've heard the complete stories. If the Ponciana blooms more than normal, you're going to have an active season,
Right.
and one is going to hit the Bahamas. If the lizard tail is less curly, it means you're going to have a more active hurricane season. I've heard them all, but there's no truth to that.
Right. So in terms of what we rely on, science is
Yes.
the best prediction
Yes.
tool
Yes.
to ensure we know exactly what's
Going
out
on?
there.
Definitely.
In terms of, and I watched in a lot of cases when we have these storms that form, and you see sometimes the hurricane hunters that go up in the aircrafts into the
Yes.
eye of the storm. Have you ever at any point in your career been into a storm like that?
Yes, I went in one of them, Irene.
Irene,
Yes.
right? And what was your experience like?
It was
in
great.
the
They asked me to go back again, but I turned them down. Once
Right.
is enough for me, but it's an eye-opening experience as a meteorologist, and I do recommend every meteorologist who get a chance to take advantage of it. And it opened my eyes in terms of what makes hurricanes strengthen, the conditions in a hurricane at the time, flying through a hurricane, and the impact that these hurricanes have, and the impact that the forecast that you're dropping what we call radio sounds into the hurricane, the eye of the hurricane, and into the eye wall of the hurricane. And you understand what importance that have on not only just in your country, but the entire region.
Right.
So it's an eye-opening experience. And
What is the experience like seeing the sheer force of a hurricane when you go through, of course, the outer bands, and then you come into the eye of
Yes.
the storm, which is, in terms of its nature, completely different than those outer
Yes.
bands.
Going into the eye wall is an experience. It's like you flying through with turbulence in the plane, the same conditions you have. You just have that in a more significant way. You bolt it down, and the plane goes up and down in rapid up and down movement,
Right.
and then you get into the eye, and you see a clear blue sky with sunshine. With it looks like nothing's happening, but you know that you have to go back to that eye in a different direction and enter the same problems again.
Right. Over the last century, we've had changes in climate and sea surface temperatures as well that have altered the intensity and frequency of storms in the Atlantic. We've talked a lot about climate change, about paying attention to these changes in surface temperatures, surface sea temperatures. And as I said, we've seen where there's been at least some, or at least it looks like some correlation between those factors in the intensity and frequency of storms. As it currently relates in terms of our country's outlook on climate change, and especially as we have talked about so far, Mr. Neely, our susceptibility to these sorts of storms, how should Bahamians view climate change and even research into perhaps how we mitigate against some of these changing temperatures of the sea? Is it something that we really can control?
Well, with terms of climate change, we're having more hurricanes thanks to climate change. You're having more intense hurricanes because of climate change. When I first joined the Department of Meteorology, the average hurricane in a particular year, the average hurricane was 10 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Nowadays, thanks to climate, within the last 20 years, you now have an increased amount of hurricane activity in the region. You have, on average, you now have 14 7 named storms, 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes now. Where compared to 10 hurricanes, 6 named storms, 10 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So now that's been up now to a significant amount. So you're now seeing more hurricanes, and we have it to show. And here in the Bahamas, we have in 2015 we had Hurricane Joaquin, 2016 you had Hurricane Matthew, 2017 you had Hurricane Irma, 2019 you had Wilma, 2022 you had Nicole, and those others that brushed the Bahamas. So you've seen more intense hurricanes, and the economy has been impacted by that now, because Hurricane Dorian of 2019 cost the Bahamas $3.4 billion in hurricane activity in terms of devastation.
What category was that? That's so?
Dorian was Category 5.
Oh, yeah.
You had Category 4. Joaquin was Category 4, 2004, 15. Matthew of 2016 was Category 4. Irma of 2007 was Category 4. Matthew was Dorian was Category 5. So you have more intense hurricanes. Prior to that, you had Andrew of 1992 was Category 5, and that only became a Category 5 10 years later. You had Floyd, Category 4. You had and Sandy and those others, but they were not major storms. But now these were the last 10, 15 years. You have more deadly hurricanes, and you had more devastating hurricanes to impact the Bahamas. So now we're seeing changes, and not only in terms of climate change. You're now seeing it's not just the hurricanes. You're now seeing it. For example, if you just have, when I first came to New Providence, you didn't have a big major problem with flooding. Nowadays, you have flooding in areas that never flooded before. You go on East Bay Street, the government spent millions of dollars in terms of trying to mitigate the flooding in that area, but even with just afternoon thunderstorm, you're having flooding where cars can't pass near Commonwealth Bank.
15, 20 minutes of rain.
15, 20 minutes of rain. So you can imagine, extrapolate that into a hurricane, so what you would get to a hurricane activity would be even worse. Now, fortunately, we only had Matthew of 2016 to impact in a significant way, and we saw the impact of that. We saw the impact of Matthew 2016,
Right.
But the other hurricanes, we didn't have a major impact in New Providence, but even with that, you still had significant severe flooding in low-lying areas.
Right, and we've seen the differences in terms of between a Category 3 and a Category 5 hurricane, in terms of the impact on human life and infrastructure. I believe the Hurricane Dorian, which affected Grand Bahama and Abaco, was pegged somewhere around, I believe, $2 billion in terms of the impact to infrastructure there.
Yes.
But in terms of, we talked about how hard it can be to predict the intensity by which these storms make landfall. I remember Hurricane Dorian seemed to progress from a Category 3 to a 4 to a 5 hurricane somewhat rapidly.
Yes.
So in terms of, when you're, so to speak, under the gun, in terms of to come up with, of course, these different models to share, with colleagues in the Bahamas Department of Meteorology or NEMA or disaster relief or any of these other bodies that are assembled to disseminate this information to the public. We've already talked about the difficulties that can arise in doing so. But in terms of looking at, even some of the past hurricanes that you have written about that have had devastating effects, primarily in New Providence, there have been, some of those hurricanes that we talked about in past interviews, I believe in 1926 and 29, 30s, that
33.
Destroyed churches throughout our country. Can you talk about any of those, some of those most severe ones?
The severe ones, right now I've just written a book. It should be out next week. Right. On the Great Bahamian Hurricanes of 1933. We've had 5 hurricanes that year that impacted the Bahamas. And 4 of them were major hurricanes that impacted the Bahamas. And 1 was Category 5. We've only had 4 Category 5 hurricanes impacting the Bahamas in record time. 4, yes. You had the Great Abaco Hurricane of 1932. You had the Great Cuba Bronxville hurricane of 1933, you had Hurricane Andrew of 1992, and you had Hurricane Dorian of 2019. You've only had 4, and all of them were very devastating to the Bahamas.
Right.
And in the 1933 season, you had a Category 5, and you had a Category 4, the Treasure Coast, called the Treasure Coast Hurricane, which just devastated the Bahamas. The difference between now and back then, imagine what you have in Hurricane Dorian. The Bahamas haven't seen major hurricanes impacting the region, impacting the Bahamas like the hurricanes of the past.
In the entire, I think, prime ministership of Sir Lyndon.
No, he never
you
encountered a
only
hurricane.
I don't think you had any major.
He never encountered a major
You had
hurricane. Sir Lyndon never encountered a major hurricane.
Hurricane Betsy, I think, in
Betsy 65, then you had Dawn of 60.
7, I think.
The Dawn was 1960, Betsy was 1965.
Right. But
And
no major hurricane.
no major hurricanes, no. And hurricanes go in cyclic periods of 30-year increased hurricane activity, 30-year decreased hurricane activity. And for some strange reason why, we don't know. And so Lyndon leadership administration occurred during the time when there was a decrease in hurricane activity.
Right.
And so he never really had any major hurricanes to impact his government. Now, every other prime minister had a major hurricane that wrecked their administration.
Right.
Every other prime minister experienced a major hurricane in their administration. So,
Right.
on the periphery, you had Francis, Jane, and Wilma. You had Honorable Hubert Minnis. You had Irma of 2017. You had Dorian of 2019. Honorable Hubert Ingham. You had Hurricane Andrew of 1992. And in fact, you had Floyd as well.
Right. So hurricanes have become even more than a climate concern, but for politicians in our country, a political concern.
Yes, you can say, because you can say whether you like it or whether you believe it or not. Hurricanes, Francis, Jane, and Wilma, impacted to this day the economy of Grand Bahama, still not recovered 100% from those hurricanes, and you can argue that hurricanes played a major reason for that. And because of whoever was empowered at that time, their activity or inactivity in Freeport played a major role, whether they captured the popular vote in Freeport. Right. So you can play that hurricanes had a major impact, and persons in Freeport, because Francis, Jane, and Wilma were so bad, a lot of them had to travel to the capital, Nassau, to find jobs, and other islands of the Bahamas to find employment. And to this day, the economy of Freeport still has not recovered from that. You have people who still live in Nassau because of those hurricanes, and it's not returned to Grand Bahama. And the economy of Grand Bahamas has been impacted by them, right, by those hurricanes in a significant way.
Given the cyclical nature of hurricanes that you explained that we have in our country, 30-year intervals, 20-year intervals, where would we fall exactly right now in 2025 in terms of whether or not we're closer now to a period of stability, or are we still?
No, we're still in the active area of hurricane activity.
Right.
And the problem is too, you now have the impact of climate change impacting the season. So you now have warmer sea surface temperatures, giving you more hurricanes as well. So how that will impact the cyclical activity of hurricanes remains to be seen, still remains to be seen. But right now with climate change, you're seeing more hurricanes and more intense hurricanes. And that plays a major role in the cyclical activity as well.
Right. And I'm interested in your next publication, Mr. Neely, that you mentioned comes out next week. Because in terms of a year that you mentioned in 1933 with so many major storms in one year, I'm interested in looking in some of your publications. We've talked about, for example, the destruction of St. Matthew's Church or
yes.
St. Agnes in
Trinity
1 year.
Methodist Church in 1 year.
In 1 year, virtually almost all of the...
Yeah. In 1926, you had the Trinity Church was destroyed.
Right.
In the 1926 Nassau hurricane. It was also damaged in the 1926 Great Miami hurricane.
Right.
In 1928, it was damaged again. In 1929, it was damaged. In 1933, it was damaged. So basically, every major storm, those churches were damaged. And not only just Trinity, you had Zion, South Beach was damaged in the 1929 hurricane. St. Agnes, St. Matthews, and those other churches, Salem Union Baptist Church, which at the time was on Bay Street, was destroyed in the 1929 hurricane. So you had many of those churches were destroyed, and many of the houses were destroyed as well.
Do you explore in the book, and can we glean from 1933 with such an active season, with such major storms in one year, can we glean from then, how Bahamians then coped with so many multiple major storms in one year, and perhaps how those 1933 hurricanes would have shaped Bahamian society or migration, yes, or even the economy?
Yes, it was different back then. In terms of hurricane activity, back then you didn't have no ZNS. For example, ZNS never came about until the 26th of May 1936. And the reason why ZNS came about was because of those hurricanes in 1926, 28, 29, 30, 32, 33. And what happened is that whenever a hurricane came, they had no radio to warn them. So the persons that's in back then, sponging was the #1 industry in the Bahamas. So many of those ships would go out at sea, not knowing a storm was traveling. Sometimes they'd go for 6 to 8 weeks in terms of on sponging trips.
Right.
And
with a major hurricane traveling,
they had no radio. They had no
certain death.
The only way they knew that a hurricane was traveling, they watched the seabirds. If they saw seabirds flying in unusual activity, they saw them in droves. For example, the white-crowned pigeon, or the seagulls, or the frigid birds, which I talk about in the book. You saw those birds flying in from the Keys onto the mainland. They knew that a storm was traveling. They knew that they knew a storm was traveling. They knew that something caused that bird to change his trajectory, change his normal pattern. For example, the birds I grew up in South Andres, and it was usual to see the wild white-crowned pigeons flying in from the Keys at 7 a.m. till about around 8, 9 a.m. Then in the evening time, after 3, 4 p.m., they fly back out to sea, taking berries that they collected on the mainland, right, back out to sea to feed the chicks. Now, if they saw that at 12 noon, those birds flying back, they saw those birds flying, they knew that something caused that bird to change its trajectory. So what they would do, they immediately turn their boats around, go to the nearest key or go to the nearest island, and try to wear out the storm. Now, what would happen is that some of them would get caught in the storm, not knowing that a storm was traveling. And in many cases in the books, in the 1866 hurricane, you had 387 persons died in that storm, most of them sponge fishermen. In 1899, you had 334 Bahamians died in that storm, most of them sponge fishermen. In 1926, you had 258 Bahamians died in that storm, most of them sponge fishermen. In 1928, you had several persons died, the unknown total died in 1928. In 1929, you had 142 persons died in that storm. 1932, you had 18 persons dying in that. 1933, you had 48 persons in one storm alone. Right. So you had major storms. And the problem with those storms, those individual storms held the island, those persons who died in those storms held the economy together. When a storm devastated the region, they didn't have anybody the men would get together, go to one house and build a house back. They would go to the next house, build a house back, and they formed a community, and they lived as one.
But were there any Bahamians who chose at that time, because of storms and the intensity of those storms, to emigrate from the Bahamas?
Yes, a lot of them in the 20s and 30s immigrated from the Bahamas, and they went to Nassau. Many of them went to Nassau, New Providence. Many went to America, United States, and some of them some came back. Some went to pick fruits, and during the season, and during the off season, they came back to the Bahamas and stayed. But most of them immigrated away from those islands to get away from the storms. Right. And the reason why we have ZNS is because of those storms. There was some, and for example, in 1926 hurricane, in the Bight district alone, you had up to 62 persons dying in the Bight district alone. 62 men died. So most of the women complained because most persons who died were the male. And right. In the sponging industry, you had boys, because school ended at age 14. So most of those boys and men were on the sponging trips. So when a ship went down, it went down with the entire ship. Most times, the entire crew would go down with the storm. Right. And so that impacted the family. And back then, the women never worked. Their job was to take care of the home and take care of the children.
Right.
So if the father died and the boys died, they had no way of taking care of the children, so it affected the family as well, family structure.
Right. We talked already so far, Mr. Neely, about the issues as far as inland flooding in our country
Yes.
are concerned, as well as in the past, what some of these hurricanes have done in decimating the economy, family-owned economies, and the economy in New Providence. We're talking now about, of course, tourism as
Yes.
our number one industry, one that is dependent upon not only the availability of resorts, properties, hotel rooms, but also travel. If we were to have the same sequence of hurricanes today, how different do you think the outcome would be to some of those other hurricanes?
I think if we had a hurricane that struck in the 20s and the late 1800s, it would be disaster. Because imagine, okay, for example, with Hurricane Dorian, it impacted two island nations,
Right.
Grand Bahama and Abaco.
Right.
New Providence wasn't affected. In fact, by the next day, most of the hotels were open back up because with the storm,
Right.
after the storm passed. The other island, Exuma was open as well. But most of those hurricanes in the 1800s and early 1900s, they affected every single island. Fortunately, we've not had a hurricane that impacted every single island in the recent times. So imagine you had the damage of Dorian on Abaco and Grand Bahama. Imagine that for every single island in the Bahamas. That would be catastrophic.
Right. Well, Mr. Neely, at this point, we have to take our first break on the program. When we come back, of course, I want to talk more so as well about Hurricane Dorian, which is remembered as the most devastating hurricane so far in our country's history. We'll take this first break on our program, Jones and Company. We'll be right back.